Well, we're coming to a kind of interesting point now. Interesting point. I mentioned, with some emphasis at the beginning that what we're dealing with is a split. Is a split in terms of, the conceptual level, the level of theoretical operations, and the level of the natural level. Well, it's quite obvious, without saying much, that what is missing here in that operation so far we've seen is what is in between. What is in between is the sheer length of history. You don't have to, be particularly sort of concerned about it, but it comes, automatically to one's mind that, when you're dealing with something like minerals, when you're dealing with something like the absolutely elementary processes in the natural world, from that you have to move to the levels where you eventually begin to pick up the more kind of articulated levels. Where is language, where is tradition, where is history, where is culture in its time. And that's all building it up to where we are. We are a result of highly sophisticated kind of history. And to reduce it down is very difficult. It's probably like the conversation that Freud had with somebody, and the somebody was saying, it's all interesting, what you're discovering in psychoanalysis, but it's just like trying to understand the smell of the roses, analyzing the fertilizer. There's a limit to it. And that illustrates in one sense also from a different angle what we're talking about. There's a ground out of which things sort of develop. And the nature, we don't have such a thing even. We cannot talk about nature nowadays. What we can talk about is natural world. More elementary, more natural than we are. But pick up anything you want to consider to be nature as such. It's always infected already by civilization in one way or another. Therefore, we're talking about natural world. Fair enough. So we are in a theoretical territory. What I would like to now very briefly do is just to illustrate the position which we are in and what is involved in that situation. What is really in it as hidden? What is in it as latent? And we can understand it only if we go very briefly, at least, through the sequence. Architecture, up to the 17th century, was always designed. Everything that has to do with architecture as a field was always taking place in a framework of reference. And the framework of reference where you derive your principles, the ultimate court of appeal, the ultimate sort of ground on which you build anything you do, the principles of design. They were established in the framework that we can describe as cosmological. There is no better way to describe it. Cosmological framework. And the cosmological framework, you can call it natural world framework, whatever, but cosmological is probably appropriate. The essence of it you can still see if you go to Wittkower, his famous book on architectural principles in the age of humanism. What you find is that practically all that architecture stands and falls is based on principles like proportions, harmonies, symmetries, you name it, the whole lot. All the principles that you're talking about are in fact derived eventually in our European culture, eventually from Platonic cosmology, Timaeus. Okay, so the proportion, 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 related to the musical harmonies and blah, blah, blah. All that stuff, I'm cutting short, long story. Mm-hmm. All that stuff is simply in cosmological framework. Now, the cosmology is a kind of interesting beast. The cosmology is something which is sort of there. It can be described, it can be talked about, can be derived principles from it. So architects would sort of operate with orientations. They would know south, east, and blah, blah, blah. Verticality, horizontality. They would know the problem of horizon in their designs and so on, location of pieces, etc. So all that. But the important thing is that the cosmology has its place somewhere. It's happening somewhere. When you want to say anything about it, when you want to kind of understand it or grasp it, it's not just a question of writing. It's a question of the whole thing as a whole. And the thing as a whole was always embedded in cities. Cities is practically the first visible, the most visible image or territory of the cosmic city. It's not by coincidence, that the Greeks talk about cosmopolis, and we still use the term some is cosmopolitic, means, the whole thing in one go, and so on and so forth. So the cosmos and city comes together very much, and it's embodied in those sort of forms. For instance, this is map of world, but the essence of it is the center, and the center is Jerusalem. Fair enough. It could be any other city, but in this case, because for the Middle Ages it was mostly focused on Jerusalem. So the city and cosmos. What is interesting, to illustrate that is that one of the very first printed books was chronicle called Nuremberg Chronicle, Schädel, because the author, but produced in Nuremberg, in the town. And, he has hundreds and hundreds of illustrations, and there's a great deal of talk about history, blah, 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 topography, geography of the world. And when the notion of cosmos comes in, it's illustrated by the image of Jerusalem. So the Jerusalem and cosmos are just one thing. So they took it for granted, that's what it is, fine. Those are the kind of illustrations of some of the principles that we're dealing with. Dozens and dozens of examples. I'm very drastically cutting it down. What is interesting is about that diagram is that it tells you that the city, which is enclosed, is in fact extended into the horizon of the reality as a whole. In other words, for the cosmic scale, you have to move out of the city, but you can move back again and eventually find your orientation then and foundation of the culture in there. What is actually quite, good illustration here is that cities will be not only built but seen that way as kind of cultural sort of embodiments of the overall complete sort of image of the reality world. This is a city which is taken, from Earth, still there. You can see it almost as it is now. South Germany, called Nördlingen. What is interesting about that is that they saw the city as something which is potentially ideal. So, in this case, the way of the circle, it's seen as a kind of Jerusalem. But what is interesting about it is that the elements of the city, particularly the gates, will be then replicated in the main element of it, which is the central piece, which is church, very often cathedral. The cathedral is practically the city in a nutshell. It's referred to as city and has gates. The entry, west portal, usually is just like the gate to the city, and so on and so forth. In other words, the city has its horizontal presence, but then it comes vertically into the kind of ultimate cosmic context and reference. So as I said, you still find many places around Europe where this particular configuration is in place. But, the important thing is to keep in mind that it doesn't matter what happens, what kind of changes, the city remains still, even today, still the primary base or embodiment of culture. That's where culture is still taking place in its most, elaborate, sophisticated manner. So, city and reality as a whole is somehow connected in a way that it brings the invisible, the overall kind of reality that we cannot possibly visualize indirectly into the scale and nature of the city. Now, we have to continue further now. That will be still Vienna. You can see, that particular thing. Charter will do the same thing. There's much to say about that, but I'm finishing that particular comment. Just one little illustration from manuscript, French, 16th century. What is interesting here is telling you exactly how they saw the city, what the city is about. We are in the middle of Paris, as you obviously know, Notre Dame. On the bottom, this is kind of assembled the Parlement de Paris, which means they are the people who are running the city. That's the council. And the sky is opening, and of course, the ghost, the light and wisdom is coming from heaven just on them, enlightening them. So the heaven above and the people down there who are running the city, who give it everyday structure, order, blah, 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 and life, are just simply in contact, permanently in contact with what's happening above. And that, of course, is not by coincidence taken next to the cathedral, because what we have been saying so far, the broader picture is now transformed into a symbolic image, and the symbolic image, of course, has its effect in terms of concreteness of the everyday life of the city itself. Fair enough. We can choose many, many examples, and I'm choosing obviously only a few very, very typical, just maybe no more. Because everything before 17th century would be structured that way. There is no way out, particularly in the sphere, well, culture probably generally, but architecture in particular. You cannot move without referring to, what is involved in your world and beyond. What is your world based on? And we know, that the territories like numbers, proportions, and all the rest were involved in absolutely everything. Details of a door and so on. Everything would be sort of structured spontaneously, automatically, in that sort of manner and in that sort of framework. Now, the important thing is that to do with cosmology. Cosmology, in nutshell, is what is above and what is below. When you say the word cosmology, you don't look at sky. We do it today, but that's misleading. Cosmology means up to 17th century, maybe 18th century in Europe still. It means that what is above is happening down here, and that's exactly that picture illustrates it. But in principle, the cosmology means not only the movement on the sky, but also the movement on the earth and what's happening there, what's growing there, and what is eventually the development of it, the history of it, and so on. So, we're dealing with season, we're dealing with day and night, we're dealing with orientations, we're dealing with reference to the sun. The sun, you can see in the spring there is a different kind of light in the natural world than in the autumn and the winter and all that. So that's all coming together as a cosmological sequence and cosmological pattern. The important thing is, and we normally don't realize that, most people don't seem to be kind of sensitively aware of it, that particular framework is gone by 17th century with the radical change into much more sophisticated system of quote-unquote cosmology, which in fact is not cosmology anymore, but it's astronomy. Cosmology is replaced dramatically by Copernicus, Kepler, you name it, all these people from 17th century onwards, by astronomy. The modern cosmology, when you look at it closely, and you go back in time and say, well, suddenly, somewhere around 1600 and something, there is no more cosmological picture. Everybody's talking about, the movement of planets. So it's astrophysics eventually, or planetary movements, movement of the bodies in the absolute space, blah, blah. Now, that's a kind of interesting position, isn't it? Because what it means is that if you lose that, cosmology, as it was built as a cultural framework, and now it's gone, it's not cultivated anymore because it's all cut off, the bottom is gone, and all is there just. So we cannot, from Newton and from those people, you cannot really get any answer to what's happening with seasons, what happens with plants, what happens with animals and people and history, and so on and so on and so forth. The only thing which is left from that cosmological picture is contemporary astrology, which appears in the fashion magazines. That's it. The cosmology as such, we don't have today. We don't have it. We can talk about it, but we don't have it. It's just nonsense. So all we have is astronomy. Now, if architecture and culture was structured around in the framework of cosmology, the cosmology is not available, then what? Then what? Substitute. So what substitutes the cosmological framework as something which is a structure of the whole is substituted by history. History comes in its place. From that time on, people building their principles on genealogies. What is first, what is the oldest? That's where history comes in. And the history, of course, is substituting the principles, because that's where architecture principles will be derived from. They will be derived from reconstruction of Solomonic temple, Tuscan temples, blah, 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 the whole lot, and ends up, as everybody knows, with the prototype, the ultimate source of architecture principles is the primitive hut, 18th century Logier and co. Well, what is amusing about it is that there are people still today here, even in London, who still believe in it. They still live on primitive huts. No names. Locrier and co. So it's difficult to believe, that suddenly the primitive hut could be that. What is interesting about that, and that's very interesting, of course, for us, moderns, that with the cosmology, there is one territory for everybody. There is one cosmos, there is one sun, one sequence. If there is a spring, it's good for the Austrians, for the Swiss, for the Germans, you name it. It's just there for everybody. It's one thing. But history is not one thing. History are many. History is never succeeded to be general. There is no such a thing as general history of mankind. There are many. What it means, relativity. So relativity comes into it. And that period, 17th, 18th century, up to 19th century including, is of course the process of relativization. Now the transition would tell us probably more what is really happening. And I show you now two images. Well, that's what's happening. That's Copernicus' image. This is the debates that eventually come out of it. And it's already then, even in the astronomy world, there is no one astronomy. We don't have one astronomy. Already 17th century, and today still, as you probably know, there are different models of astronomic structures. They call it cosmology, cosmological systems and so on. But there is no agreement, between astronomers, which one is really the correct one. And that really begins in the 17th century. Those are the characters. Tycho de Brahe sitting on the right side, and one of the Jesuits next to him, negotiating which one may be. And they actually did at that time believe that there's something like 3 or 4 possible answers to it, not just one. There's a Copernican system, there is still the Ptolemaic system, there's the old one, there is new Tycho Brahe system, and there's somebody called Riccioli system. So, doesn't matter. What is interesting is that with the astronomy being substituted by history, the cosmos has not disappeared. The cosmology did, but cosmos is still there. The sun is still there, the seasons are there, the life is there. We still believing, or not believe, but we're living in that particular cycle of cosmic conditions. We are cosmically conditioned. Very nice illustration of that is the transition, when the history is taking over, but the cosmos is still not completely forgotten. This is painting from somewhere beginning of 16th century by a German painter called Alldorfer, and what it does on a very small piece of canvas, he paints the victory of Alexander the Great over the Persians. So it's a victory, it's a battle that ended up in the death of Darius, the Persian king, and end of that event, death. Now, what is painted here, you can see how the painting is people, but second half is that. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? Why to bother? The sunset suddenly becomes incredibly dominating issue. In other words, the lost battle, the death of the emperor or king, and the sunset comes together. The battle is a cosmic event still. It's still seen that particular way. I will touch on it as we go later. So history. In 18th century, it happens to be Fischer von Erlach and a few more people, some French people like Leroy and so on. They start looking at architecture not really in terms of principles, how you design, using geometry or proportions or particular configurations, forms, figures and so on, and configuration as a result, but time, history. And they start thinking about precedents. He's producing one of the first, probably, we're talking about Fischer von Erlach, Viennese architect, producing the first history of architecture, 1720 something, 6. It's interesting that he starts, the beginning, the first books are miracles, the wonders of the world, 6 wonders of the world. The Mount Athos, the pyramids, you can go on and on. But out of that he goes into history then, and from the history he goes to Oriental civilization, he goes then to Rome, and from Rome he goes eventually to Europe and to his own pieces. In Rome he would discover, for instance, the reconstruction in his treatise, the naumachia, which means the theater where water battles are taking place. By the way, it is a kind of plan of what eventually is going to be turned, this naumachia in the temple, in the palace of Nero, the Domus Aurea, that's in the garden. That was eventually destroyed and turned into Colosseum. So that's what you see now, is the foundation of Colosseum as it stands today. But that's a little detail, just to give you the scale of what he's talking about. When it comes to architecture, he does proposition plans. Big plan, among other things, ideal vision of Schönbrunn. That should be the Central Europe equivalent of Versailles and bigger. center of the Holy Roman Empire. Just to give you an idea, he goes through history, the Herculean Columbus, Persian Empire is the beginning, the tent and the polo play, blah, blah, sequence of terraces, and end up in the chateau itself. And in front of it is the coudonade, kind of oval. And that's exactly the scale of the Naumachia. That as Colosseum today, size, would fit into that forecourt. So that's give you an idea. But basically what he's dealing is, he doesn't talk, in his treatise on architecture, he doesn't talk at all about principles, how you do this, how you do doors, and he just tells you about the precedents, historical precedents. They did it like that, we can borrow from it and continue, blah, 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 blah. Now, so that's a stage of history, but now we're going into further stage, and we're going into a very critical moment, somewhere around 1800, actually. In France, disciple, he was the assistant and eventually disciple of Boulez, the revolutionary architect, somebody called Durand. He was the first professor of architecture in a technical school, the first technical school, university, like in Europe, one of the first, probably first, was the École Polytechnique in Paris. And he was the first professor of architecture. What he did, took all the buildings, he himself, that he considered to be of importance. The whole history, he practically selected from it what he considered to be of importance. And you can see samples of it around. Goes to Greek temples, bit of China, and so on and so forth. Gothic cathedrals on the right, on the charter and so on. So he makes the selection. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Provocatively interesting. He himself now decides what is relevant in European history of architecture. Selects all the examples, puts it together, and creates this particular document, large piece, called Recueil et Parallèle, Survey and Parallel of Edifice of all genres, ancient and moderns. Fair enough. Then comes the second stage. He uses his students to draw all these buildings that he selected into the same scale in the method which is newly at that point invented or put together for the first time. It is descriptive geometry. First time that plan, sections and elevations would be coordinated, so you can go from one to another and they make sense as one piece. Gaspard Monge was the guy behind it. Anyway, so we had this descriptive geometry. So all these buildings, his students draw to the same scale in terms of plans, sections and elevations. Now, having all this material on the table, he himself, with some help, made a selection of the critical elements. What would be the critical elements in all the buildings of European history or world history of architecture? Walls, windows, staircases, you name it. So out of these elements, almost like a Lego, he creates a kind of elements of architecture. It's interesting that for the first time the term elements of architecture, the element notion of architecture, which becomes titles of books eventually, particularly in France, Éléments d'architecture and so on. Elements and composition, architectural composition, the completely new phenomenon. You don't compose architecture in Baroque, you just make it happen. Composite means that you have pieces to compose, to put together. So it looks like that. I'm just using few pages from that. All these pieces, elements, and it demonstrates in his treatise that everything under the sun can be made out of it. From buildings, from villas, to town halls, to churches, to you name it. Okay. The result of it, of course, is, what we see here. The Germans in 20s start worrying about all this stuff. And the relativity of the history and no ground on which you can build anything solid. As you can read in German, in what style should we build? Question mark. Because the situation reached a point of absurdity where the choice was so. Schinkel, that's a vision of the future, synthesis of some sort, but based on principles that would be some kind of a synthesis of classical and Gothic. So they played with those possibilities. Schinkel himself designed the mausoleum of the Queen Charlotte in that way, but then eventually it was built like that, no problem. It reaches point of absurdity, as you probably know, in London. Nash was designing in London and in cities in a late neo kind of classical. But in the country, he was doing cottages in Gothic. And in London, he had two offices. One of them was doing the Gothic stuff, and the other stuff was done in classical. So they don't confuse each other. So we're reaching that kind of point of absurdity. But you probably notice that what happened now is we moved from the cosmological framework into historical framework, and now we already moved with him, with Durand, into theoretical framework, because history is gone. Once you have done the survey, you distill all the pieces from it. You've got the essence of all that already has happened so far. Therefore, the history is now substituted by theory, theoretical models.